today I talked to Gabriel Debenedetti from New York Magazine, and he was in the spin room in Philadelphia as Donald Trump walked in. He describes what that scene was all about, but also the entire debate night. And he has tons of sources within both the Trump and Harris campaigns, so he talks all about what each campaign was trying to do that night and who succeeded. Well, Gabriel, welcome to the podcast.
It's good to be here.
Well, welcome back. Were you at the debate?
I was at the debate. It was quite a scene. Kind of had a sense it was going to be an important one. The Harris people kept saying, this is going to be the most consequential debate in history. And I kept thinking, well, the last one was pretty consequential, actually. But yeah, it was pretty interesting.
Yeah, hard to top that. I want to hear about the spin room, but let's actually go in sequential order, because that seemed to be one of the more interesting spin rooms we've ever had, because Trump came out and spoke at the spin room. But let's rewind the tape a little bit just to give our audience an update. I gave an update after the debate. We know a little bit more. It looks like the ratings were significantly higher than the last debate.
Yep.
I think at least 10 million more people tuned in this time. Trump, there's like a final tally on who spoke, and Trump had spoken for approximately 5 more minutes than Harris in this, which I think is not totally surprising after watching that. He seemed to be more interested in extending his time than she did. But you wrote this piece titled How Kamala Scrambled Trump's Brain, and you allude to the fact that you talked about how they were raising the stakes. It seems like they did better at scrambling his brain than even they thought they would.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had written it previously, and I've been talking to a lot of people in the Harris campaign about the way that they were thinking about this. And one of the things that they were eager to dispel was this idea that she was going to go in there and do the prosecutorial, get him in a corner kind of thing. That was sort of like what the resistance MSNBC community wanted to see. A repeat of how she went up against Brett Kavanaugh or Jeff Sessions in those hearings when she was a senator. But they basically determined that, partially because of the setup when the microphones were muted when the other one was speaking, but also because of what she needed to do in this debate, that wasn't really the way she was going to approach it. So she didn't go out and try to cross-examine him. Instead, what she wanted to do, based on polling, they know that this is what they have to do with voters, is introduce her as this sort of representative of a new generation of politics and paint him as old, chaotic news. So what she tried to do was really let him, reveal himself to be this sort of erratic, not trustable, unsteady figure that a lot of people realize. And that's, of course, why he lost in 2020. A lot of people think of him that way, but they think that a lot of folks have sort of forgotten, or just that hasn't been top of mind. So what she really wanted to do was, bait him into some corners there. She knew he was going to start talking about conspiracy theories or talk about things that really were not productive for him. And it worked.
Yeah. And everybody, I think, at this point is familiar with the crowd-sized bait on the immigration answer. But in reading your piece, you pointed out quite a few moments throughout this debate where there were moments where I wasn't picking up on it necessarily as, this kind of psychological warfare, for lack of a better term. But you write about how basically from the beginning of this debate to the end, they were peppering her answers with sort of moments or lines that would incite him.
Yeah, and, it was actually interesting because the first few minutes of the debate were not her strongest in that sense. When they were just talking about the economy, I think there were a lot of Democrats who sort of thought, well, if she can just fight him to a draw on the economy, because people's perceptions of the economy is not great right now, and it's no better way for him to tie her to Biden than that they'd be fine. And I think they felt okay about it. And, she brought up this negative analysis from some professors at Wharton, knowing that he was going to jump on that and just try to talk about how he went there, as if that was, a way to alleviate people's feelings about how the economy isn't treating them well or how they want more money. But that was a good example of how she was trying to paint this idea that, well, I'm going to talk about you. This guy is actually going to talk about himself and nothing else. There was also the moment where he sort of started to talk about these conspiracy theories about pet eating, these undocumented migrants eating pets in Ohio. I think that's what you were just alluding to. She obviously knew he was going to do that because she didn't have to bait him to do that, but the people around him had been talking about it. JD Vance had been talking about it. And instead of fighting him on it or saying that's not true, what she did was she said, she sort of turned to the camera and said, like, is this really what you want? A bunch of Republicans have endorsed me, sort of giving an permission structure to moderates or to people who like to think of themselves as Republicans who, might not agree with her much on policy, but are just exhausted by the entire Trump show.
Yeah, there was something you pointed out in your piece that I had forgotten about, which was in this exchange over crowd sizes.
Yeah.
Which, sidebar, like, a lot of people in my life, I grew up on Staten Island, a lot of Trump people. The one thing I'm hearing from people is, like, how baffled people are that he would be that gullible. And it's actually one of the weird, it's actually, I'm not going to convince, none of these people are going to be convinced to not vote Trump. But what I'm hearing from them is, like, honestly, a bit of, like, shock that this guy could be manipulated so easily. And I think for independent voters, you've got to imagine they're looking at this and being like, in a weird corollary to when people were looking at Biden, being like, how could this guy be president? I think, like, when they look at Trump and could see that he could be so blatantly, transparently manipulated in ways that the audience could see, that's got to concern people. The second thing in that interaction that you pointed out and that I had forgotten was that there were two accusations in this crowd size thing. One was that people are bored, but the other was that he wasn't really about his people. I forget the exact line. You probably remember it, but there was like an accusation that he only cared about himself. And in answering it he defended the crowd size and totally just let go the line about him only caring about himself, which only seemed to underline the point Harris was trying to make.
Well, if you think about it, it was actually interesting because they weren't talking about crowds at all. She just wanted to get this out there early on. It was clearly a planned thing that they wanted to do, and it worked. She was talking about something else, and then she said, actually, what I want audience members to do is go to a Trump rally, because you'll see people get bored. He starts talking about some crazy shit, frankly. She talked about the Hannibal Lecter stuff, right? He just brings up random conspiracy theories, and her point was, what you'll never hear you'll never hear him talking about is things that actually matter to you, the voters. Now, that's an actual point that you can make as a candidate, saying, my opponent is in it for himself. But she knew that he was going to, do this for her. She didn't have to say, after he, took this and ran by saying, my crowds are big and your crowds are fake, she didn't have to then turn to the camera and say, you see, audience, what I'm talking about? Because it was just so obvious. And, speaking of manipulation, it's so easy for her to manipulate. And, previously when we've seen opponents talk about this, they say, Putin's manipulating him, Kim Jong-un's manipulating him, Xi Jinping is manipulating him. And of course, she talked about that too, but it was much more effective to just show how easy it is to bait this guy.
Yeah, and you talked about how the start of this wasn't the best. And from what I understand from inside the Biden campaign, their dial tests had her losing two exchanges, Afghanistan and the economy, and winning everything else, which checks out to me. And obviously, their conclusion of this is that the war goes on because that's the economy is the one set of answers you would have wanted, other than maybe abortion. You can't really lose that exchange, but that's the one they really wanted to win. So they still have their work cut out for them. And in your piece, you talk about there are certain subgroups here that they really need to win. Older voters, younger men, or they're not going to win the younger men, but they want to, limit the damage. Right. And then Hispanic men, Black men in particular. Let's start with the older voters, because you wrote about this. What was their strategy coming in to appeal to older voters? And what did you see in this debate that tells you, okay, this was targeted really for that audience?
Yeah. And to be clear, they never thought that this debate was going to end and they were suddenly going to get like a 10% bump in the polls. They know that this is going to be close. And to the point that you were just making, with all of these groups, they're really fighting on the margins. The vast majority of people are already all in. And there was a huge audience here, but they're pretty open about the fact that the people who are going to determine the ultimate, way that this election goes, a lot of them aren't watching and will only be watching the coverage and the clips. And we'll get to the spin room. That's why that was important. But with older voters, it's a little different because older voters are watching more than others. That's where you saw, I was talking to a pollster who works with the campaign a little bit before, and she was making the point that older voters have sort of these like ingrained beliefs about what a president looks like, what a president acts like, talks like, what experience they have. And these people often unfairly don't tend to believe that she has that kind of experience, even though she was a senator and has been vice president for 4 years, and particularly when it comes to foreign affairs, national security, things like that. So that's why she did this at the convention. She's doing this in ads. She certainly did it on the debate stage, detailing all the foreign leaders she's met with, talking a lot about Ukraine and Russia, making sure that people remember and know, Trump doesn't actually want Ukraine to win the war. He just wants it to be over, which is actually a very compelling point to a lot of independent voters. But when it comes to older voters in particular, she talked in a lot of detail about the meetings she had with Zelensky over the war, meetings she had in the region. She talked about weapons that the United States has provided in the region by name. She talked about javelins and Abrams tanks. These are not things that you would expect from someone who doesn't know the details, the minutiae of foreign policy. The idea basically being, this is an American value that I'm going to stand up for. And also you can trust that I've actually done this stuff. I talked to a few people who were close to her and close to the campaign afterwards, and they basically said, yeah, I mean, it wasn't subtle, but you do what you have to do. And by the way, at the end of that riff, she said specifically, what we're trying to do is stop Putin from having his eyes on the rest of Europe. Again, this is an appeal to older voters who remember, some of them remember war in Europe. Those are the oldest voters, but still, they remember the specter of it, certainly. And then she said, this is especially important for countries like Poland. There are 800,000 Polish voters here in Pennsylvania alone. And she just said it. And one of her deputy campaign managers said to me after the debate, he's like, well, there are 800,000 Polish American voters in Pennsylvania. And, the campaign is not under any illusions that those people are only going to vote based on like Polish sovereignty and threat from Russia. Obviously, these are people who have many, many priorities, but they're listening. And she's specifically saying, listen, I'm paying attention to you folks. That she can win all 800,000 of those people? Certainly not. But, that's a group of people that she wants to keep the margins tight. So, trying to be surgical about this in this debate was the whole idea. She didn't need to totally reframe the way people thought about her just to appeal to the kinds of voters that she needs on those margins in order to, in a state like Pennsylvania, in a state like North Carolina, keep it close if it looks like Trump is winning, or start to build a little bit of a lead if she is.
Yeah, it's funny is trying to figure out what she thought was important enough to clarify or double back to and not. And fracking was such a
Bingo.
noticeable issue for her. There were a lot of things that he was saying about her. Your dad is a communist, whatever, and she's letting all these things go.
Right.
The one thing she could not let him get away with was the fracking answer, which goes to show you that they are thinking, like you said, in a almost Mark Penn-esque micro-targeting way about the electorate here. And that was the thing that, even though she had clarified it earlier in the debate, she was like, I've got to go back to this answer.
Right. Well, and part of it is that, like, not only was she in Philadelphia, not only did she know that Pennsylvania markets were super paying attention to this, but like, there's a way of looking at this election that it just comes down to Pennsylvania. We know that rural Pennsylvanians in particular are very interested in the fracking question, and that, similar kinds of questions were bad for Hillary Clinton, by the way, in 2016, in Pennsylvania and similar states. So very obviously, Harris knew going into this, she couldn't let Trump have the final word on her fracking thing, because he was just going to talk about a previous position that she had held on it, which was banning it. We've seen in Pennsylvania Democrats who previously called for banning fracking, then reverse course, win statewide. That's what John Fetterman did, and he won. So Harris is clearly like, she's not trying to be John Fetterman here, but she is saying Pennsylvania is the most important state in this race. Just got to make sure everyone fully understands with no ambiguity. That's not who I am. That's not where I stand. And it was really interesting because you're right. He kept saying it. And with so much of the other stuff, including, every other answer of his was talking about millions of people coming in from insane asylums across the border. I mean, I think he literally doesn't know what asylum means, and that's why he says that, right? But like, he's talking about stuff that's just not true, and she sort of let a lot of it slide on fracking. Again, she's turned back at the end and said, I just can't let this one go. That's really telling. And again, there's no subtlety to it, but there doesn't have to be.
One thing that was telling was this exchange over January 6th. Let's play a clip.
Mr. President, on January 6th, you told your supporters to march to the Capitol. You said you would be right there with them. The country and the world saw what played out at the Capitol that day, the officers coming under attack. Aides in the West Wing say you watched it unfold on television off the Oval Office. You did send out tweets, but it was more than 2 hours before you sent out that video message telling your supporters to go home. Is there anything you regret about what you did on that day?
You just said a thing that isn't covered. Peacefully and patriotically, I said during my speech, not later on. Peacefully and patriotically. And nobody on the other side was killed. Ashley Babbitt was shot by an out-of-control police officer. that should have never, ever shot her. It's a disgrace. But we didn't do this group of people that have been treated so badly. I ask, what about all the people that are pouring into our country and killing people that she allowed to pour in? She was the border czar, remember that. She was the border czar. She doesn't want to be called the border czar because she's embarrassed by the border. In fact, she said at the beginning, oh, I'm surprised you're not talking about the border yet. That's because she knows what a bad job they've done. What about those people? When are they going to be prosecuted? When are these people from countries all over the world, not just South America, they're coming in from all over the world, David, all over the world, and crime rates are down all over the world because of it.
But let me just ask you,
David, when are those people going to be prosecuted? When are the people that burned down Minneapolis going to be prosecuted? Or in Seattle, they went into Seattle, they took over a big percentage of the city of Seattle. When are those people going to be prosecuted?
But let me just ask you.
You might ask her that question.
You were the president. You were watching it unfold on television. It's a very simple question as we move forward toward another election. Is there anything you regret about what you did on that day? Yes or no?
I had nothing to do with that other than they asked me to make a speech. I showed up for a speech. I said, I think it's going to be big. I went to Nancy Pelosi and the mayor of Washington, D.C., and the mayor put it back in writing, as you know. I said, you know, this is going to be a very big rally or whatever you want to call it. And again, it wasn't done by me. It was done by others. I said, I'd like to give you 10,000 National Guard or soldiers. They rejected me. Nancy Pelosi rejected me. It was just 2 weeks ago. Her daughter has a tape of her saying she is fully responsible for what happened. They want to get rid of that tape. It would have never happened if Nancy Pelosi and the mayor of Washington did their jobs. I wasn't responsible for security. Nancy Pelosi was responsible. She didn't do her job.
The question was about you as president, not about former Speaker Pelosi, but I do want Vice President Harris to respond here.
What's interesting to me about this is the language he uses here. So when he talks about Ashley Babbitt, he uses we in this clip. And then when he talks about the officers defending the Capitol, he uses they, which honestly, I thought should have gotten more attention. There's certain things he does, like having Laura Loomer on his team when he goes to 9/11, for example, somebody who is a 9/11 truther, which are things that you would think, like in normal politics, would be a much bigger deal.
Well, part of this is that and we saw this in 2020, and it was part of his undoing in one of the debates against Biden. He really does live in this bubble of right-wing media, and he's surrounded by a lot of these right-wing media figures that live in conspiracy world, and they talk about things that are totally foreign to most swing voters who don't really pay attention to a lot of news or certainly a lot of social media, because a lot of what he's talking about is not news. But you see this with a lot of the January 6th stuff because it's a huge topic at his rallies, but not really among most voters. I mean, people have moved on from this. There's a reason, by the way, that Harris doesn't talk about it as much as Biden did. Biden wanted to talk about it all the time. But for Trump, it's sort of so obvious that the January 6th rioters have been mistreated that he just treats this as like, yeah, of course we're going to talk about this stuff. And in fact, I wrote this in my piece, but internal to the Harris campaign, they were doing, testing among undecided voters in battleground states throughout the debate. And the lowest point for Trump was when he was going on this rant about how he obviously won in 2020, how how these people were mistreated. He's going to pardon these people. And that's partially because, obviously a lot of voters don't agree. They don't like what happened on January 6th. And Trump was really parsing what happened minute by minute, or trying to, But part of it is also this entire embedded theory in the Harris campaign, which is she's not going to not talk about this stuff. But her whole point is, I want to move us forward. I don't want to keep relitigating the political past, the Biden-Trump era. She wouldn't put it that way, obviously, because, she has to support Biden. But this last era has been really hard for a lot of people. I represent the future. I can't believe we have someone who's trying to, talk about how great January 6th was. Or, how all those people were mistreated in the aftermath, at least. So he's really trying to position himself as, well, he successfully has positioned himself as the leader of the right wing. She is trying to appeal to whatever remaining slice of voters there are who, aren't necessarily sure how they feel about her, but, certainly don't like to hear just this right-wing provocations from Trump. You saw him before the debate hanging out with a bunch of people who are really sort of fringe right-wing conspiracy figures. And you certainly don't see that from her. There's a reason for that. She's super laser focused on these voters who are not that engaged in this stuff. And again, I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but like she doesn't have to be subtle about this. She's just sort of doing this appeal, which is like, I don't, this is conspiracy shit. I'm just talking about what actually matters to you guys.
Yeah, there's a funny. I was looking for this. I was trying to find it. We'll put it in the show notes. There was this tweet from Eric Erickson, the right wing radio host, where he was like castigating his own people, being like, "You've been talking about all this crazy dog eating nonsense, and now Trump is repeating it." And I thought to myself, true, but is that really the fault of the conspiracy theorists or the guy who was president of the United States who's just willing to just say it on stage without really checking on it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but like, let's also be clear that like, I mean, that sort of does do a funny job of infantilizing both the conspiracy theorists and Trump himself, right? As if no one has real agency here. But the other part of this that I think is really important not to lose sight of is something that we were just talking about slightly, which is like, this is still a tied election. It's not as if he's really only getting votes from these people.
Right.
I mean, there are a ton of people out there who have basically said, fine, whatever. He's, it's the classic thing when he was president, people would say, I don't care. I don't like the mean tweets, but like the economy is doing great. Right. Whether or not that was true. That's certainly how a lot of people feel about this race, which is like, take or leave his, provocations, the exhaustion that comes with him. But people don't feel as if they're doing better than they were 4 years ago. And it was really interesting that she didn't say, she sort of got to this, but not really deeply. Well, 4 years ago, actually, we were in the depths of this pandemic that this guy mishandled. No one here had no one looking at this had a job and certainly hadn't seen their family in months, whatever. She did get to that stuff, but it's not a central part of her messaging. As the economy, I think there are a lot of people who still want to hear more from her, not necessarily in terms of the specifics of her tax policy or things like that, because I think that's sure, there are some people out there that want to hear more specifics, but that's rich to say when she's running against Trump, who, that specifics are not his thing, let's say. But when it comes to the economy, she still does have a lot of work to convince people that what she talks about as the opportunity economy is really something that, applies to them, because a lot of people simply don't feel as if they're doing as well as they were economically pre-pandemic. That's just the fact on the ground.
Yeah, and I think, they won't say this publicly, but people inside the campaign, when they're doing a postmortem, they wish they had handled the economic segment of this debate better. They're not going to say that publicly, but that's the conversation happening internally. And you got to imagine that's how they're going to try to spend their time over the next few weeks. Just one other thing on the January 6th piece that just struck me about this is that Trump emphasized in his answer that he was like, I told them to be peaceful. But at the same time, he's pardoning the people who are violent.
Yeah.
So it's like, there's like, I know that this isn't about politics, which just to me, as somebody cares a lot about that moment.
Oh, sure.
It just really, I find it really hard to listen to.
Sure. And you think about what this is like for someone who like considers themselves like a Mike Pence voter, by the way. Like Trump was out there basically saying he didn't really repudiate in a serious way the people who were talking about hanging Mike Pence. There's a lot of voters out there who still consider themselves sort of like traditional Republicans in a Pencean style, although Pence is a very like religious conservative, for example. But there are a lot of people who think of themselves as basically like moderate Republicans who aren't sure about Trump. So when you hear about himself specifically identifying, like you said, the rioters, and positioning the Capitol Police again, like you said, as the other side, that really does strike a lot of people really poorly. And again, that was the worst polling moment of the debate for him. Harris had a bunch of ups, a bunch of downs, more ups than downs, but he had that one like very striking low. It's interesting that was the low point for people, not the like crazy stuff about eating dogs.
Right. The other major low moment was abortion, which we've talked about a little bit. I'm curious as to what you think is going on here, because we've been tracking on this podcast, trying to play the game of like, what is he up to, which is always a dangerous game with Trump, because sometimes it's not super logical. But
totally,
from what I understand, at a high level, he tried to moderate his position on abortion. He was testing the waters. He got some backlash, and now he's kind of swung back to his old position somewhat, but is still trying to get credit for moderating it. But it's not clear what he's moderated, so he's emphasizing the federalism of it. And at the same time, he's throwing J.D. Vance under the bus, who the funniest part of this whole debate was when Trump was like, well, J.D. can have his own positions. But it's like, what J.D. is saying is J.D.'s more to the right of you on abortion. He's trying to say you veto this abortion bill because that's what he thinks you want, not because that's good for his career.
Totally. I mean, I think that if you want to step back for a second, there's like a clear fact here, which is that both campaigns know that this entire election could be about abortion. I mean, every election since Roe has been very clear for the liberal side, for Democrats, for the choice side. So Trump did really badly in this dial testing of this debate because he wasn't clear at all about how he stands on this stuff. Like you just said, the way that I read it is he thinks he needs to rhetorically, and again, it's dangerous to assume that he's thinking too much about this stuff, but it seems like he thinks that he needs to rhetorically moderate and say, actually, we're all on the same side here. I'm trying to be the reasonable one. There are some crazies on all sides. Democrats want to do 9 months, want to murder infants, which of course is not true. And Harris was like, what are you even talking about, man? She was very effective because she just talked about, individual people and how the bans affect them. With him, I think one of the really interesting things that he keeps doing is saying everyone wanted to overturn Roe, and Harris doesn't even touch that because it's just so obviously not true. But he's trying to position.
She did something interesting with it, if you remember. Yeah. In my ears on first listen, she didn't touch it, but then when I re-listened to it, I'm like, oh, she actually did frame her answer. She said, she goes, everybody wants this. She repeated it multiple times. She's like, everybody wants this. And I thought that was an interesting moment because she was like, normally Trump's exaggerations don't seem to cost him anything because it's like people bake it in. But I think the construction of his sentence that everybody wants this was a rather
good point,
dangerous framing for him because that allowed her to take whatever prepared answer she had and be like, well, everyone clearly she was prepared to talk about the specifics, right?
But you can also see totally she was very prepared to talk about the specifics. This is something she's worked on personally for a very long time. You could tell that he just wanted to, he's not really capable of talking about anything other than in terms of look at this great success that is my fault, or look at the disaster that's someone else's fault. And he started to say basically Roe being overturned is my fault and it's brilliant. And then he started to praise the Supreme Court justices. And you could just picture, the advisors in Trump world sort of pulling their hair out because they might love the Supreme Court justices. They may even love that decision. But the single least popular part of this whole thing is overturning Roe in the first part. I mean, obviously the effects are the really bad stuff, but everyone in the country knows what happened there. This is the central political fact of the last 2 years here, and every single election has gone against Republicans basically because of that. So reminding people that he is at the center of it, that it's his fault. I mean, it's like politics 101 in some ways. This was the widest gap. David Plouffe tweeted this during the debate.
He said this is the widest 40 or something, right?
That's right, negative 40. Yeah, that people by 40% people preferred Harris's answer on abortion, and of course that's what this race is going to be about to some degree. And that's why the Harris campaign is leaning hard on states where there is an actual vote, up or down vote on abortion rights referenda. States like Nevada and Arizona, they're feeling pretty good because they can just show people this clip. And by the way, to give a sense of how good the Harris campaign feels about some moments in this debate, they're trolling a little bit, but on X yesterday, the official account said our new ad just dropped. And they just showed the whole debate, right? The whole point being hello, this was pretty great. Sorry. Sorry, not sorry, basically.
Well, okay, let's go to the spin room here. So they get to the spin room. Just paint the picture. I want you to tell me what happened in there.
So spin rooms suck, right? This is an important thing to know. Spin rooms are really sort of very lame moments where a bunch of reporters need quotes from people who are all going to say either they're representatives of both campaigns, they're surrogates, allies, whatever, saying, my guy's great, the other guy sucks. Tonight was a huge victory for the American people because they saw my candidate, blah, blah, blah. So, I'll just go back for a second. At the last debate, I've got a lot of these things. At the last debate, it was so obvious that Biden had bombed that, the Trump people were the only people out there for a while. The Biden people were trying to figure out how the hell are we going to even spin this thing before they got out there and talked about,
do you remember the tweet, by the way? The Democrats put the tweet out, basically saying they won the debate. I was like, it was an automated tweet. I was like,
totally.
This is insane.
Totally. Well, there are a lot of people out there who that. They just go into Automode, right? Because so many of these debates for so long, we're so used to debates not really mattering, right? But finally they matter in a different way. But anyway, this time, while Trump was giving his closing statement, this spin room popped to life. I mean, people weren't even paying attention to his closing statement because Josh Shapiro, the Democratic governor of Pennsylvania, had come out and he was ready to go. He was ready to say, what a huge success. So from then, that's basically how it went. There were a lot of Trump people out there, but, their message was basically border, border, border. She needs more specifics. It was very, straightforward stuff. And the Harris people thought the debate spoke for itself. They didn't even have to really spin, right? So it was kind of not that interesting for a while. It was a big spin room. So I after like half an hour or 45 minutes was like, forget this. I'm just going to go and write. And like, I don't need to talk to some, senator who really needs to be quoted. This is not that interesting after a certain point. So I start to walk out. We're in the convention center in Philly. My hotel's not that far away. I'm like, great. I'm going to go and write my story. But as I'm leaving, two of Trump's top advisors, Jason Miller and Chris LaCivita, walk by, and I hear LaCivita say, he's coming. Immediately, I was like, oh, Trump's coming. It was so obvious what he was talking about. They were talking to each other. But it was clear that Trump was going to be there. And that's because Trump can't stand not being the center of attention, can't stand not driving the narrative. And, his natural habitat is when he has 3,000 microphones stuffed in his face, right? Or cameras all over his face. And he knew that Sean Hannity was there, by the way. That's who he really wanted to talk to. But like, just to be clear, candidates don't go to the spin room. It's not in the same building, so he has to get his motorcade to take him between the two, from the debate hall. And it's just such an obvious sign of desperation that you have to go and talk to reporters after your debate. Harris was out there, hanging out with supporters, which was all seen on TV. Like, she was, celebrating, and then she was going to go to sleep. Trump basically had to go and talk to a bunch of reporters and try and convince them that, what they had seen with their own eyes and ears wasn't that bad. And he just did the same thing that he had already started to do on Truth Social, which is complain about the moderators, say, actually, Harris had everything memorized. Again, he did that with Hillary too, like the idea that preparing for a debate is a bad thing. And then he just talked about border. And again, there's a reason for that. He thinks that that's a big political winning message, and it may in fact be, but there was nothing new, and it was pretty, desultory. A lot of people were interested to hear from him. Of course, he's Donald Trump, but he wasn't offering anything really. And then he went to go talk to Hannity to do all the same stuff. By the time he was doing that, everyone's attention wasn't on him. It was on the fact that Taylor Swift had endorsed Kamala. And that's what people were really focused on. And this is what's going to move voters, not what Trump is trying to tell us in the spin room at midnight.
Really interesting timing on Taylor Swift, by the way. And I was looking at these numbers. So this is as of 24 hours after her endorsement. I think this was yesterday's data, which was that more than 300,000 people had clicked on her link in the immediate hours after the voter registration link that she put out there.
Yeah.
And that Ian Bremmer tweeted out that, and this was yesterday, that there were 35,000 plus new voter registrations recorded just in that period of time.
Yeah.
And I was just looking at the websites because I'm vaguely aware that there's just different laws around when you could register or not. Most of these swing states, you can still register. So that's fascinating.
That's right. And some states voting is started, by the way, is starting this week. So like,
Pennsylvania of all places is, I think, in a couple of days. Pennsylvania,
and North Carolina is getting there too. So the idea that we're not like, that we talk about the things as if it's election day. Obviously, your listeners are smarter than that, but we know that like voters are making decisions right now. So when you have someone like Swift, obviously there was probably some back and forth with lots of people trying to convince her to do this. But like, if Democrats can see this surge of voter registration that they've had since Harris became the candidate, if they can see that continue, they're not going to complain about that.
Yeah, you can imagine, I was talking to somebody about this yesterday, that the Swift endorsement after the debate would have been particularly important if it was a mixed or bad result for Harris. So if you're thinking, I'm not sure there was coordination or not. I'm not sure what was going on. She claims no.
Right.
It would have been particularly helpful if Harris had either lost or it was mixed, because that becomes like at least a cherry on top of whatever's going on. Whereas now, like, I just think the timing is essential for the Harris campaign, because you can't wait any longer. If your goal is to bring new people into the process, which is probably one of the best like things that a Taylor Swift could do to the extent she has an impact at all, it's to get new people to register, people who didn't vote before to get invested. And that needs to be an early enough announcement that you can move the dial in registration.
That's right. And you also think about so much of the way that the Harris campaign has conceived of their goals, in the 2 months or less than 2 months since she's been the candidate. There's really been this like organic momentum, and they've just been looking for ways to try and keep it going. It's not a traditional campaign in that sense. So you're right. Usually you would try to use this to buoy people who needed support. But right now, this is such an extraordinarily compressed timeline that she's working with. They're just throwing everything they can at the wall just because they don't have time to try and meet these things out over the course of a year or two, as most campaigns do.
And so, you talk about the spin room, and it's probably a good place to kind of close on is,
sure.
So Trump's main argument is, and his people, right? I've heard almost nobody say he won the debate, even on his side.
Right.
even Matt Walsh was tweeting to his own people saying, look, I'm not going to lie to you. But what they're talking about are the moderators.
Yeah.
And I've thought a lot about this. I'm not sure I love moderators getting involved or not, but I'm not sure it mattered, because the worst moments that Trump, first of all, like, don't say people are eating, like, you know, don't say black people are eating dogs, because then ABC News is in a difficult place, because that's a safety concern of the people who live in Springfield or wherever this was happening, is that those people are now going to be under threat if you don't clarify that. So the two sort of main points I remember of clarification were, are we killing babies?
Right.
And are black people eating dogs? And I'm like, I'm
Seems
not
reasonable to me.
I'm not sure
say those things are just not true. Right.
But also, the worst moments for Trump, you know, if you look at the time allotted, was that he talks too much and he didn't make sense. And then when he did make sense, he sounded like your crazy uncle.
Yeah, totally. And I think at this point, there's something that's really important, which is that, like, a lot of the political press, especially when we're on like day 2 or 3 or talking about this stuff, people like to really pick nits about like what specific policy points were you know, elided, or how people talked about, you know, specific whatever. The specifics matter, right? But like, I was talking to this pollster before this, to a Democratic pollster before, and she sort of said, like, yeah, there are things that Harris is going to say, there are things that Trump is going to say, but the truth is that so much of this is impressionistic, and we forget this every single time. That real research shows that what people take away from the debate, 70% of it is impressions. It's the theater. 30% of it is what's actually said. So for Trump, when you have this overwhelming feeling that he was overmatched, that he talked too long, and that he sort of represents this like rambly, messy past, that's terrible for him. And it's not unsophisticated to say, if you just look at this from a theater perspective, from a performance perspective, the fact that he talked so much longer and that ABC let him, that's a disaster for him. But guess what? Like, you can't really complain about that credibly. No one on earth is going to believe that he wants to talk less. It's Donald Trump.
Yeah, and I was shocked by the mics, because I was expecting tight mic control, and I'm glad they didn't have that. But because of all the negotiation, they're saying like the mics are cut off, which they did. The mics were technically cut off when it was somebody's allotted speaker time. But I didn't realize that there would be these sort of interstitial moments where both mics would be on at the same time.
That was interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And
I'm not sure that the campaign stuff.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, it was just some of the more interesting moments of the debate.
I'm not sure that the campaign stuff that was going to happen, because there had been all this get back and forth about the mics being muted, but you did have a little bit of crosstalk. You know, there wasn't ever a moment where they could really have like a full conversation with each other, which is probably for the best, given how it did work out. You know, for like our sanity trying to transcribe that, it would have been a lot. But there were moments where one of them tried to respond and the mics were off, and that was interesting. But, you know, like both of them, I think, had good moments when they were actually able to engage each other. But again, if we're just going to talk about the theater of this, Trump didn't look at Kamala Harris once during this debate. It was very, very striking.
Yeah, Tim Miller was yelling. You probably saw him there in the spin room.
I did.
I think when Trump was there, he was screaming at her, screaming at Trump, saying, "Why won't you look at her?" So when you look at Trump in front of the microphones, and he wouldn't say anything.
Yeah.
Her coaching was very strong on that. You know, like you got to believe that Karen Dunn, you know, my former boss, is the one who's running the debate prep this time, which is also like for political nerds. Ron Klain has been running debate prep since I was a child, and Karen Dunn had been kind of like running this sort of VP debates and things like this, a younger sort of powerhouse attorney. And this is the first time she has fully run a debate prep, and I think it showed. Because I think Democratic debate prep was getting stale before. And I think what we saw here were some moments where I think, like, if I'm being honest with Ron, I think it was a little bit of paint by numbers at a certain point. It's like, okay, we'll get the briefing book, we're going to have our key moment, whatever. You could see a little bit more creativity in the prep here. And you could, you know, maybe it was just Harris herself improvising, but I think a rule of debates is nothing's ever really improvised with a candidate like, you know, a traditional candidate.
There's definitely not much improv with a traditional candidate, like you said. To be fair to both Ron and Karen, I mean, she has been on the sidelines or behind the scenes of many debates, so it's not as if she's
kind of like an understudy. She definitely learned the process.
She's been around.
Yeah.
Right. And Klain, you know, was in an interesting position because he was one of the people who was really he actually has had a decent relationship with Harris in the past, but he was absolutely one of the Biden or bust people at the end. of the Biden stuff. So he was not really going to be
Still
involved
feels
there.
like it, Gabriel.
Yeah,
in some of his public comments.
There's a lot going on there that I think we that there's going to take many months to unpack all this. But I do think that when there's not much improv, but there is certainly different things that you can do with different kind of candidates. And Harris certainly has some things, even if we just look at like the obvious things like energy, that Biden doesn't have an ability to like really think on her feet and speak on her feet in a way that he doesn't in a debate setting specifically. Now, he has a lot of upsides that she didn't have, right? Like there's a reason that he won in 2020 and she didn't, especially when it comes to appeal to certain voters who, still want to hear a lot more from her. But in a debate setting, yeah, she hasn't done this before on this stage, but, she clearly had a lot of things prepared and she clearly remembered this is the right moment to deploy this specific argument. Candidates often get a lot of like flack for not actually answering the questions. But I would love for them to actually answer a lot of these questions, but it's really hard from a political perspective to blame them for not answering them. And there were sometimes she was asked questions where she just didn't answer it. And she sort of started to talk about her own thing entirely. It's
the
not
first
surprising
question
when we hear
was the most noticeable.
Absolutely.
I thought that was dangerous for her. I was watching that thinking to myself, because sometimes it's not noticeable that they're not answering questions. That was very noticeable. And Trump inexplicably didn't push her on it.
Well, I can explain it. He's not capable of it. And he didn't notice it, right? Like, I think with him, he has a lot of obvious political, I don't want to say superpowers, but abilities to do things that for most candidates would never work in a trillion years. I'm not sure that's a compliment, but it's an analysis. But we're not surprised when he doesn't answer questions, right? But with her, it was very striking. But very quickly, we saw what she was doing. They've made the calculus that, no one's reading this as like a real interview. She's just trying to hit the points that she needs to hit the specific voters. There's time for, complicated policy interviews if she becomes president, but this is not the moment. That's the way that they're thinking about it.
Yeah. Well, for our listeners, depending on which side of the aisle you're on, this will either be good news or bad news, but Nate Silver's model this morning, which obviously doesn't take into account any of the polling post-debate, has Harris at a 38% probability of winning the Electoral College, yet winning a 58% probability of winning the popular votes.
Here we go again.
That is some rough numbers. And we went through this, I think, a couple of weeks ago, where basically she needs like a 4-point cushion to feel somewhat comfortable, but really 6 because of the Electoral College bias, according to Silver's model. Whereas if you're at the 0 to 2 range in your Harris, you actually have more in terms of if you're polling 0 to 2 ahead, or gain 0 to 2% of the popular vote, you actually have less of a chance of winning than not, because of the
bias of the Electoral College. Yeah.
So,
well, that's why you're going to see her be super aggressive on the campaign trail for the next month and a half. There's no choice. That's just, we're going to,
and no more collective moments here. There could be totally unplanned things that happen or whatever. There's no sentencing, et cetera. There's the VP debate, but honestly, who cares?
Right.
And so I'm sure that will be fascinating. Will it move the dial? I would have a hard time believing that. Although J.D. Vance is talented at like taking things that should be uncontroversial and making them controversial. So that could go one of two ways. He could either do something totally destructive, which I would be surprised about given the amount of prep going on, or he's such a vilified figure that maybe he shows up and seems somewhat conventional, which would be the smart strategy.
And we'll see if this happens in the first place. Like they said that they want to, but I think one thing this election has shown us is let's not assume anything before it actually happens.
If I were the Harris campaign and polls are coming back with some decent bounce off of this that feels sustained, I would pull that debate.
Yeah. Or just say, I'll show up, but, let's have another Trump-Harris debate.
Oh, my God. I don't know if I would do that. The side winning doesn't want the debates.
Right.
And I think if Harris comes out of this with a bounce, they wouldn't want that. Well, Gabriel, is there anything you want to plug?
I would just say keep reading New York Magazine. All my stories there going to probably be a lot for the next few months, weeks. I don't even know. Time is complete mush. And I would always ask people if they want to understand a lot about Democratic politics these days. I wrote a book that came out almost exactly 2 years ago about the relationship between Biden and Obama. Obviously, neither of those guys is front of stage right now, but that dynamic is certainly very interesting and underpinning a lot of what's going on. It's called The Long Alliance. So people want to read that. I'm not going to complain about that.
Well, thank you, sir.
Thank you.